Hey everyone, Michael here with Kinetic Data, continuing our orientation series on the Kinetic platform. In this video, we'll be covering the workflow component of the Kinetic platform. If you haven't watched the previous videos in this series, we highly recommend you hit pause and go back to do that. In those videos, we covered the overall structure and components of the platform, getting your local development environment stood up, and much more. Let's dive into workflow. I first want to define workflow. Workflow in Kinetic is all about your business process. Whenever an event happens within the system, we have the ability to capture that event and initiate a predefined process, also known as a workflow. Workflows can be tied to events like user login, form submission, and more. Let's start by taking a look at a simple workflow. The workflow I have pulled up is more of an intermediate complexity, since it has so many steps, but is a good example to start with since it shows a fairly typical business that you might use when building a Kinetic workflow. This process is for a simple approval. You can think of it as a living Visio diagram. The end user submits a request, which is routed for approval, and then either approved and a ticket created or denied. All routes in the process end with the closure of the submission. Each step in the process is represented by a node and the flow is represented by connectors. If you study this workflow, you will see steps in the process that update the submission status for the end user, as well as steps that create tickets or send notifications. I want to take a moment to talk about a specialty type of workflow that can be used or built in the Kinetic platform. This type is called a routine. Routines are, basically, a workflow within a workflow. We are going to drill into the create approval node because creating an approval isn't just one step, there are several pieces to it. By using a routine instead of just a simple node, we can build out those steps behind the scenes, as you see here. But they are represented by a single node in our larger workflow that prompts the workflow builder for the input it needs to run. Now, let's move on to show you how easy it is to build a workflow within our workflow designer. First, I'll start with the form that will be kicking off our workflow. We are going to use the simple request form to add a user to a group. You can see that this form is super simple. The only field on the form is the username, which is pre-filled with the user's logon information. Let's build this workflow. I'll navigate to the workflow section, click New Workflow, and give it a name. The event dropdown is going to let us select the type of activity that will kick off our workflow. Here, I will choose Submission Submitted. And now we have a blank slate to work from. We'll keep this simple, but add at least a few steps to give you an idea of the whole process. The first step we will add is an update to the submission activity to let our requester know what is happening. To begin, I am going to click this plus sign to add a note and then click and drag to anywhere on the canvas. Then I need to select what I want this node to do. Since it's a submission activity, I am going to narrow my choices by searching. And I will choose the Submission Update Status task, as this is exactly what I want to do. And then we will step through the wizard, giving the task name and completing the fields. For Submission ID, I am going to use the helper at the end here to locate the Submission ID mapping from within the platform. And then the status I am going to manually enter. Next, we'll add the step where the user will be added to the Active Directory group. This time, I click the plus at the end of the prior node, and my task is Active Directory User Add Groups. Just like the last time, we'll give it a name and then move on to the fields. As you can see, this one is quite different from the last task. Each of these nodes is from an integration framework within the platform called a handler. Handlers are essentially packages of Ruby and XML created with a specified structure to communicate with a system outside of Kinetic. A few quick notes about handlers. First, we have a library of available handlers so you don't have to start from scratch. We'll take a quick look at that library when we finish building this workflow. Second, if you do find a need to create one from scratch, our documentation library has information on how to structure the files that can assist in this process. There is also a deep dive video plan for modifying and creating handlers as well. And finally, the next big update to the Kinetic platform will include a new integration framework that will eventually phase out the need for handlers. It's a little like having Postman within our platform, and we'll take our already easy to use workflow builder and make it even more user friendly. I am going to finish up this step by completing the mappings. I'm going to add a few more steps to complete my workflow. First, a step to let the user know that their request is completed. Just to show you some additional functionality, this time I'm going to clone the status in progress step since I want to perform the same action just with a different status value. Then I will finish up the workflow with one final step. This one will close the submission itself. Then you will notice I am choosing the task that updates the submission rather than just its status, so there are more fields I can choose from. I'm only going to map the submission ID and the core state value. This will close out the submission at the platform level rather than just updating the status for the user to see. Now that I have a complete workflow, I'm going to save and we are done. There are definitely improvements that can be made to this workflow, but it's a good, simple first design. Earlier, we mentioned our integrations library. Let's head over there and give you a quick tour and download a sample so we can show you where you import them into your platform. The URL for the library is integrations.kineticdata.com. It's also linked from our documentation library. You can see here that we have pre-built integrations for a number of applications. I'm going to do a quick search for ServiceNow as this is one where we have a number of handlers constructed. I'm just going to select one at random here as we just want to show you how to get it into your environment. You can see from the page that there is information to get you started on using the handler. And I'm going to go ahead and download it here. Once it's downloaded, we will head back to the platform to get it imported. This will be done at the space level under Configuration. Within the plugins, we will go to Handlers, and from here, just import that zip file we just downloaded. The final step will be to open up the newly imported handler and include all the values that are specific to your implementation. The final value for every handler is the category field. This one is not required, but if you don't choose a value, the handler will not show up in the workflow builder. That wraps up our coverage of workflows. We'll see you in the next video where we talk about web APIs.